Did you ever wonder what it was like to be a young woman living over 1,000 years ago? What if your entire life, your very destiny, was decided for you before you could even speak your own name? What if your value was measured not by your heart or your mind, but by the wealth you brought, or the number of children you could bear, or even the power your family might gain through your marriage? Around 900 AD, across vast stretches of the world for countless women, these terrifying questions were not hypotheticals but the brutal realities of their existence. Number 1. The absolute lack of divorce rights for women. Imagine a life where a terrible mistake made on your wedding day, or perhaps by your parents on your behalf, could never be undone. Picture a world where once you were married, no matter how cruel or neglectful your husband became, no matter how dire your circumstances, you were bound to him for life. This was the crushing reality for an overwhelming number of women across diverse cultures around 900. In many societies, the institution of marriage was seen as a sacred, indissoluble bond, or, at the very least, a civil contract that overwhelmingly favored the man. For women, initiating a divorce was often an impossible dream, a power simply not granted to them by law, custom, or religious decree. Consider the landscape of Europe during this era. In the budding kingdoms of the Carolingian Empire, which stretched across what is now France and Germany, and in the Anglo-Saxon lands of England, Christian doctrine held immense sway over marital laws. The Church taught that marriage was a holy sacrament instituted by God, and that what God has joined together, let no one separate. This theological stance provided a powerful framework that made divorce almost entirely out of reach for women. A man might have limited avenues for annulment or separation, often based on specific canonical grounds, like consanguinity or impotence, but these were complex processes and rarely granted to women. A woman who faced a violent husband, a philandering spouse, or one who simply abandoned her, possessed almost no legal recourse to end the marriage. She was expected to endure, to suffer in silence, or to seek the mercy of the Church, which was more likely to advocate for reconciliation than for liberation. Her social standing, her economic survival, and her very reputation were intrinsically tied to her marital status. To be an unmarried woman, or a woman who had left her husband without proper legal sanction, was to be an outcast, stripped of protections and respect, often left in poverty and vulnerability. The family of origin, having given her away, usually had no obligation to take her back, especially if she was seen as having brought dishonor upon them. Across the Byzantine Empire, stretching from parts of Italy through Greece and Anatolia, the situation was similarly restrictive, though perhaps with slightly more defined legal codes stemming from Roman law. While Byzantine law did allow for divorce under certain circumstances, such as adultery by the wife or male impotence, the grounds were still limited and the process heavily skewed against women. A woman seeking divorce faced immense societal pressure and legal hurdles. She needed compelling evidence, often difficult to obtain, and faced the risk of being accused of slander or of initiating a separation that would leave her impoverished. Her dower, the property or money she brought into the marriage, might be forfeited if she was deemed at fault for the divorce, leaving her destitute. Even in cases where a man was clearly abusive or neglectful, the burden of proof and the social stigma of seeking divorce often trapped women in unbearable situations. A woman's entire social identity was wrapped up in her husband's household. To leave it meant stepping into an abyss of uncertainty with no guaranteed support system. The inability to divorce was not merely a legal restriction, it was a fundamental denial of personal autonomy and a forced endurance of whatever life her husband imposed upon her. Her domestic sphere, rather than being a sanctuary, could become a prison from which there was no escape, transforming her daily existence into a quiet, unending struggle for survival and dignity within a framework that denied her both. In the vast and powerful Islamic Caliphates, such as the Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad, The legal framework of Islamic law, Sharia, offered women theoretically more rights than some contemporary European systems, including the right to initiate divorce under specific conditions. However, the practical reality for most women, around 900 AD, was often far more constrained. While a woman could petition for a khul, a divorce initiated by the wife, it typically required her to forfeit her dower, the mahr, which was given to her by the husband upon marriage. This economic penalty could be a significant barrier, particularly for women who relied on this payment for their financial security. Moreover, such a request often depended on the husband's consent or a judge's ruling based on very specific, often difficult to prove grounds, such as prolonged absence, extreme cruelty, or a husband's inability to provide support. A husband, by contrast, could divorce his wife through a unilateral declaration of talaq, often with far fewer formalities and without needing a specific cause, though Islamic law did encourage fair treatment and provision for the divorced wife. The power imbalance was stark. While some educated or aristocratic women might have had the means or influence to navigate these legal pathways, the vast majority of ordinary women, especially those in rural areas or with limited family support, found themselves trapped in marriages from which escape was practically impossible without risking utter destitution or risking practicing marriages. They might suffer silently under a husband who took other wives, or squandered their meager resources, or even physically abused them, knowing that seeking to end the marriage would likely mean losing everything they had, including their children, who usually remained with the father. Their lives were dictated by the will of their husbands, and the possibility of independence or a fresh start was a distant, often unattainable fantasy. Across the distant lands of medieval India, the situation for women seeking to end a marriage was similarly bleak, often shaped by evolving Hindu legal traditions and strong patriarchal social norms. Marriage was seen as a sacred, lifelong union, a spiritual bond that transcended even death, particularly for women. Divorce in the modern sense was virtually non-existent for women, and even for men, it was extremely rare and only under severe circumstances. A woman was taught from a young age that her duty was to her husband, to serve him, and to ensure the prosperity of his lineage. Desertion, cruelty, or even polygamy by the husband offered her no automatic path to dissolution of the marriage. Instead, she was expected to endure. If a husband abandoned her, she might be left in a state of suspended animation, neither truly married nor truly single, dependent on her family or the goodwill of the community, but unable to remarry or forge a new life. She remained legally and spiritually tied to her absent spouse. The concept of a woman initiating divorce for her own well-being or happiness was almost entirely alien to the social fabric. Her identity was subsumed by her marital status, and to sever that bond, even if justified by the husband's actions, would be seen as a profound violation of social order and religious duty, often leading to social ostracism and a life of poverty and shame. The sheer lack of a legal or social mechanism for women to escape oppressive marriages meant that countless women lived lives of quiet desperation, their personal autonomy entirely extinguished, their well-being sacrificed at the altar of societal expectation. Their existence was a testament to the absolute power wielded by their husbands and the profound lack of agency they possessed within their own lives. Number 2. Strict widowhood and social death. Imagine a life where the death of your husband, a tragic event in itself, simultaneously marked the death of your own social identity, your economic security, and perhaps even your physical freedom. For countless women across the world around 900, widowhood was not merely a period of mourning, but often a swift descent into a form of social death, marked by severe restrictions, destitution, and in some harrowing cases, even physical immolation. The value of a woman was often inextricably linked to her husband, and without him, her very reason for existence in society was questioned or completely extinguished. In parts of India during this era, One of the most chilling and brutal practices faced by widows was sati, the ritual immolation of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre. While not universally enforced across all regions or castes, and its prevalence debated by historians for this specific period, the practice was known and revered in some circles, particularly among Rajput warrior classes, as the ultimate act of devotion and piety. The woman was expected to willingly ascend the pyre, following her husband into the afterlife, becoming a revered figure, a sati. For families, it was seen as a way to preserve honor and prevent the widow from becoming an economic burden or a source of temptation. The pressure on a widow to perform sati, whether overt or subtle, could be immense. Her refusal might bring shame upon her family, or she might be viewed as impure or unfaithful. Even if she escaped the pyre, her life was often one of severe deprivation. She was expected to shave her head, wear drab clothing, forgo all ornaments, and live a life of asceticism. She was often ostracized from social functions, considered inauspicious, and relegated to the margins of society, often confined to the household, performing menial tasks and dependent on the charity of relatives who might resent her presence. Her ability to remarry was virtually non-existent, as Hindu custom largely forbade widow remarriage, particularly for upper castes, consigning her to a life of perpetual celibacy and social invisibility. Her children, if she had any, would often be taken under the care of her husband's family, further diminishing her maternal role and connection. The horror of sati and the pervasive social death for those who survived represented the ultimate erasure of a woman's individual existence, her life deemed valuable only through her connection to a man. Across the Byzantine Empire and much of Christian Europe, while the violent spectacle of sati was absent, widowhood brought its own profound oppressions. A widow in these societies often faced a precarious economic future. Her dower or dowry, which was meant to be her financial security, might be tied up in complex legal arrangements or seized by her late husband's family. While some legal traditions, such as dower rights in Anglo-Saxon England, granted a widow a portion of her husband's property, often 1/3, for her lifetime, gaining access to this property and maintaining control over it could be a constant battle against her husband's male relatives, who might view her as an intruder or a burden. Her ability to manage property or engage in economic activities was often limited, and she might face intense pressure to remarry, often to a man chosen by her husband's family or her own, to secure her economic future and provide her with a male protector. If she had children, her primary role became safeguarding their inheritance and ensuring their future, often at the expense of her own desires or needs. A noble widow might find herself a pawn in political marriages, forced to marry another powerful man to secure alliances or prevent her wealth from leaving the family. For common women, widowhood often meant a swift descent into poverty, as they lacked the skills or social connections to support themselves and their children independently. They might be forced into manual labor, begging, or relying on charity, their previous status and comfort stripped away. The Church, while offering spiritual solace, rarely provided substantial material support, and chastity effectively rendering her socially inert. In the vast lands of the Islamic Caliphates, while Islamic law granted widows certain rights regarding inheritance and the ability to remarry after a prescribed waiting period, iddah, the practical realities of widowhood around 900 had still presented significant challenges and oppressions. A widow was entitled to a specific share of her deceased husband's estate, typically 1/8 if he had children, or 1/4 if he did not. However, accessing this inheritance could be fraught with difficulties, especially for women with limited legal knowledge or family support. Her husband's male relatives might attempt to deny her rightful share or manipulate her into relinquishing her claims. While remarriage was permitted and even encouraged, societal norms often placed pressure on a widow to remain within her deceased husband's family or to marry a relative, sometimes against her will, particularly if she had young children, as it was believed to ensure the children's welfare and keep property within the family. Her status as a former wife could also impact her desirability as a bride for men of higher standing. Furthermore, a widow's reputation and social standing often depended on her conduct during her widowhood. Excessive mourning or immediate remarriage might be frowned upon, creating a delicate balance she had to navigate. For many women, particularly those in less affluent families, the death of a husband meant the loss of her primary provider and protector. While she might inherit a small sum, it was often insufficient to maintain her previous lifestyle or support her children, forcing her into a precarious economic situation. Her autonomy, though theoretically greater than in some other cultures regarding remarriage, was still heavily influenced by family honor, economic necessity, and social expectations, often compelling her to make choices that were not truly her own. Her life, though not physically extinguished, was nevertheless drastically diminished, her previous comfort and security replaced by a stark reality of vulnerability and dependence. Number 3. Polygyny and its implications. Imagine a world where your husband, the one person you're bound to for life, is legally and socially permitted to take multiple other wives, each bringing their own claims to his affection, resources, and attention. This was the deeply oppressive reality for countless women living under systems of polygyny around 900. While often framed as a religious or social necessity, the practice inherently created an uneven power dynamic, fostered competition and jealousy among wives, and often diminished the status and well-being of each woman within the marital household. It was a constant reminder that a woman's worth was often conditional, and that her husband's loyalty could be divided amongst many. In the vast and influential Islamic caliphates, such as the Abbasid Caliphate, Islamic law permitted a man to have up to 4 wives simultaneously, provided he treated them all justly and equally. While this legal allowance presented a framework for the practice, the reality for women was far more complex and often fraught with emotional and practical difficulties. The ideal of equal treatment was a spiritual and moral injunction, but its practical application in daily life was often impossible to achieve. Imagine sharing your husband's time, his affection, his resources, and his children with 3 other women. The senior wife, often the first or most prominent, might hold a privileged position, but even her authority could be challenged by the arrival of a younger, more favored wife. Competition for the husband's attention, for financial support for her children, or for social status within the household was a constant source of tension. Each wife often lived in her own separate quarters, creating a segmented household. But this physical separation did not diminish the psychological impact of sharing a spouse. A woman's sense of security, her emotional well-being, and her feeling of being cherished could be deeply undermined by the presence of co-wives. She might fear being neglected, or that her husband would favor another's children, impacting her own children's future inheritance or standing. The economic burden of supporting multiple wives and their children also often led to financial strain, which could disproportionately affect the later wives or those with fewer resources. While the law theoretically protected wives' rights to maintenance, a husband's financial limitations could mean that all wives suffered. The very existence of polygyny meant that a woman's marital relationship was never truly exclusive, and her personal identity within the marriage was perpetually one among several, diminishing her individual significance and fostering a constant state of comparison and quiet rivalry. Across various tribal societies and emerging kingdoms in parts of Africa, around 900 AD, polygyny was also a widespread and deeply ingrained social custom, often driven by economic factors and the desire for numerous offspring to increase a family's labor force and lineage. In many agricultural societies, more wives meant more hands for farming and more children to ensure the family's survival and prosperity. However, for the women involved, this often translated into a life of hard labor and shared duties, where individual needs were often subservient to the collective household. The first wife or senior wife often held a position of authority over subsequent wives, but her power was never absolute, and she still had to contend with rivals for her husband's attention and resources. Newer, younger wives might be brought into the household, potentially displacing an older wife in her husband's affections, leading to immense emotional distress and a diminished sense of self-worth. The division of labor, while necessary for the household's functioning, often meant that each wife had to perform significant agricultural or domestic duties alongside child-rearing. Resources, though often shared, were rarely equally distributed, leading to disparities in comfort, food, and clothing. Each wife often had her own hut or dwelling, but the household functioned as a single economic unit under the husband's ultimate authority. The children born to each wife also created internal familial politics, as mothers vied for their children's recognition and share of inheritance. The concept of romantic love or exclusive partnership, as understood in some other cultures, was secondary to the practical and social functions of marriage. For women, polygyny often meant a life of shared burdens, emotional competition, and a constant awareness that their husband's primary allegiance was to the collective family unit and his own desires, rather than to any single individual wife. Her personal desires and happiness were rarely the paramount concern in such a system, instead being subsumed by the larger needs of the family and the husband's prerogative. In various aristocratic and royal circles across medieval Europe, while not legally recognized as polygyny, in the same vein as Islamic or African societies, a de facto form of multiple partnerships often existed for men, with mistresses and illegitimate children being a common feature of powerful households. While these women were not wives in the legal or religious sense, their existence often profoundly impacted the lives of legitimate wives, creating a similar dynamic of shared attention and diminished status. A noblewoman might be forced to endure her husband's public liaisons, the presence of his illegitimate children within the court, or the diversion of resources to his other relationships, all while she herself was bound by strict societal and religious norms to chastity. Her standing in society and the legitimacy of her own children depended entirely on maintaining her marital facade and her own impeccable reputation. This hypocrisy, though not legal polygyny, imposed a similar emotional and social burden, forcing women to accept their husbands' indiscretions without complaint, lest they jeopardize their own position, their children's inheritance, or bring scandal upon their family. The legal wife, though ostensibly the sole spouse, often found herself in a position of powerlessness, unable to challenge her husband's actions without risking severe repercussions. The very structure of power ensured that men had far greater sexual and marital freedom than women, and the consequences of such imbalance often manifested in a wife's quiet suffering, her personal dignity eroded by the constant awareness of her husband's divided attention and loyalty. The shadow of other women, acknowledged or unacknowledged, loomed over the lives of many wives, diminishing the exclusivity and personal bond of marriage and reinforcing a woman's subordinate status. Number 4. Dowry system as a burden and tranchokin. Imagine a situation where your very marriage depends on your family's ability to pay a substantial sum of money or provide valuable goods to your husband's family. Or conversely, imagine being exchanged like a commodity, with your groom's family paying a bride price to yours, effectively purchasing you around 900. And these financial transactions, known as dowry and bride price, were central to marriage customs across many societies, often transforming women from individuals into economic assets or liabilities. They were not mere exchanges of wealth. They were transactions that fundamentally shaped a woman's status, security, and perception within her new household. In many parts of Europe, the dowry system was deeply entrenched, particularly among the aristocracy and propertied classes. A dowry was the property or money that a bride brought to her husband's family upon marriage. It was intended in theory to be her contribution to the marital household and often served as her security, potentially reverting to her or her children if she became a widow. However, the practical implications for women were often oppressive. Families with multiple daughters faced immense financial pressure to amass substantial dowries, often depleting their own resources and impoverishing themselves to secure advantageous matches for their daughters. A daughter without an adequate dowry might be considered unmarriageable, condemning her to a life of spinsterhood in a convent, or a dependent existence within her family, seen as a burden. The dowry also often remained under the husband's control, at least during the marriage, giving him significant economic power over his wife. While some legal systems offered protections ensuring the dowry could not be entirely squandered, the wife herself had little direct control over it. Her worth in her new family was often directly correlated with the size of her dowry. A larger dowry might grant her more respect, while a smaller one could lead to neglect or ill treatment. In essence, a woman became an economic calculation. Her intrinsic value was secondary to the tangible wealth she contributed, reducing her to a walking asset whose future was dictated by her family's financial capacity rather than her own merits or desires. Pressure on families to produce a sufficient dowry meant that daughters were often viewed through an economic lens from birth, their very existence a future financial strain. Across parts of medieval India, the dowry system, known as dahej, also flourished, evolving into a complex and often oppressive custom. Similar to Europe, the dowry was traditionally seen as a gift from the bride's family to the groom or his family, sometimes meant for the bride's security, but more often becoming a significant economic burden for the bride's parents. The demand for dowry often escalated, especially for grooms from prestigious families or with good education or status, turning marriage into a transactional affair, where the groom's family effectively sold their son's eligibility. Families with daughters might face ruin trying to meet exorbitant demands, leading to poverty, debt, and even social disgrace if they failed to secure a match due to insufficient dowry. For the woman herself, arriving in her marital home with a small or inadequate dowry could mean a lifetime of disrespect, taunts, or even abuse from her in-laws, who might perceive her as having brought insufficient wealth. Her status within the household was diminished, and she might be treated as an unwelcome burden rather than a valued new member. The dowry often remained under the control of the husband and his family, meaning the woman had little say over its use, even if it was, theoretically, her security. This created a stark power imbalance, where her economic well-being was entirely dependent on the good graces of her new family. The threat of dowry-related disputes and violence, though more extensively documented in later periods, had roots in the foundational economic pressures of this system. It fundamentally stripped women of their individuality, reducing them to economic packages whose value was dictated by their family's wealth, rather than their own inherent qualities, trapping them in a system where their future was predicated on a financial transaction over which they had no control. In other cultures, particularly in parts of Africa and some Slavic societies, the bride price or bride wealth system was prevalent. Here, instead of the bride's family giving a dowry, the groom or his family would transfer goods, livestock, or money to the bride's family. While sometimes viewed as compensation for the loss of a daughter's labor and fertility, or as a symbol of the groom's commitment, the bride price system often reduced the woman to a form of chattel, a property being acquired. She was effectively bought by her husband's family, and this transaction could profoundly influence her status within her new household. The higher the bride price, the more valuable she might be considered, but also the more obligated she was to her new family and her husband. If the marriage failed, especially if the wife was deemed at fault, her family might be pressured to return the bride price, creating a strong incentive for them to ensure she remained in the marriage, no matter how unhappy or abusive it became. This placed immense pressure on the woman, as her family's financial standing could be directly tied to her marital stability. Her consent was often secondary to the economic arrangements between the two families. She was not marrying an individual as much as she was being transferred from one patriarchal household to another through a financial agreement. This system highlighted the commodification of women, where their worth was quantified in terms of goods or livestock, and their role was primarily seen as producers of children and labor for their new family. It further stripped them of autonomy, as their very entry into marriage was a financial exchange, solidifying their status as property rather than equal partners. Number 5. Forced marriage and lack of consent. Imagine being told that your entire future, your life partner, your home, and your destiny have already been decided for you, not by your own choice, but by the will of your parents, guardians, or community leaders. Picture standing before a gathering, knowing that the vows you are about to make are not born of love or even acquaintance, but of a political alliance, a debt repaid, or a family's ambition. This was the chilling reality of forced marriage for countless women across the globe around 900 AD, where personal consent was often irrelevant and the woman's agency was entirely extinguished in the name of family honor, economic gain, or social stability. Her voice was silenced, her desires ignored, and her future dictated by others. In aristocratic and royal families across medieval Europe, marriages were fundamentally strategic alliances, not unions of affection. A daughter of a noble house was a valuable pawn in the intricate game of power, land acquisition, and political maneuvering. Her marriage could forge peace between warring factions, secure succession, or consolidate wealth. From a young age, girls were raised with the understanding that their primary purpose was to marry advantageously for their family. Their personal preferences, desires, or even fears were secondary if considered at all. A young noblewoman might be betrothed in infancy or sent to live in a future husband's court as a child to be raised as his future bride, knowing nothing but the role she was expected to fulfill. She might be married to a man significantly older than herself, to a distant cousin, or even to a widowed relative of her deceased father, all in the name of maintaining family lines and property. Refusal was not an option. A woman who defied her family's choice faced severe repercussions: social ostracization, disinheritance, or forced entry into a convent, effectively ending her life as a free agent. The lack of consent meant that many women entered marriages with strangers, men they had never met or barely knew, whose character might be cruel, whose temperament might be violent, or whose health might be failing. Her role was to produce heirs and maintain the household, irrespective of her personal happiness. Her body, her future, and her very existence were seen as tools for her family's advancement, stripping her of any individual autonomy or right to self-determination. Across the vast Islamic Caliphates, while Islamic law theoretically held that a marriage should be consensual, often stating that a bride had the right to accept or reject a suitor, the social realities for women in 900 AD frequently undermined. For many families, particularly in traditional or rural communities, a daughter's consent was often the mere formality, coerced through immense familial pressure, emotional manipulation, or even physical threats. A father or male guardian wali held significant authority over a woman's marriage, and while he was technically supposed to act in her best interest, his interpretation of best interest often aligned with the family's economic or social ambitions. A young woman might be pushed into a marriage with an older man, a wealthy merchant, or a man from a politically advantageous family, even if she had no desire for the union. Her refusal might be met with severe disapproval, accusations of disobedience, or the threat of being disowned. For some, particularly those without strong male protectors or in vulnerable economic situations, resisting a forced marriage was virtually impossible. While a woman could, in theory, appeal to a religious judge if she believed her guardian was acting unjustly, this was a difficult and often futile process for most women who lacked the social standing, resources, or knowledge to navigate the legal system. The expectation of obedience to male authority was paramount, and the notion of a woman making an independent choice about her life partner was often alien to the social fabric. She was expected to comply, to accept her fate, and to make the best of a situation that was entirely imposed upon her, her personal happiness subjugated to the perceived greater good of the family. In various societies across Asia, including parts of China under the Tang dynasty and various kingdoms in Southeast Asia, arranged marriages were the norm, and the concept of individual consent, particularly for women, was largely absent. Marriages were contracts between families, not individuals, and they served to strengthen clan ties, secure economic advantages, or enhance social status. Girls were often betrothed in early childhood, their future spouses chosen by their parents or grandparents based on astrological compatibility, family wealth, or lineage. A young woman often had no say in who her husband would be, or even when she would marry. Her role was to be a dutiful daughter who would become an obedient wife and a prolific mother, serving her husband's family. Upon marriage, she effectively left her birth family to become a member of her husband's lineage, with her loyalty shifting entirely. Any attempt to resist an arranged marriage would bring immense shame upon her family, be seen as an act of rebellion, and could lead to severe punishment or social ostracization. She was expected to perform her duties, bear children, and manage the household, often living under the scrutiny of a stern mother-in-law. Her personal feelings, desires, or dreams for her future were entirely irrelevant in the face of these formidable societal expectations. The entire system of forced marriage, whether through direct coercion or overwhelming social pressure, ensured that women's lives were predetermined and controlled by patriarchal structures, leaving them with no power over one of the most fundamental decisions of their existence. Their consent was not merely disregarded, it was simply not considered a factor in the equation of marriage. Number 6. Child marriage and betrothal. Imagine being a young girl, perhaps barely past your toddler years or just beginning to experience the first stirrings of adolescence, when your entire future, your husband, and your home are already decided for you. Picture being legally bound to a man often significantly older before you can even fully understand the meaning of marriage, let alone consent to it. This was the deeply pervasive and profoundly oppressive custom of child marriage and early betrothal for countless girls across nearly every part of the world around 900 AD, stealing their childhoods, denying them education, and stripping them of any semblance of autonomy over their own bodies and lives. In medieval Europe, particularly among the aristocracy and propertied classes, betrothals of children were remarkably common. While the actual consummation of marriage might be delayed until puberty, the formal engagement, a binding contract, often occurred when children were still in their cradles or very young. For instance, a noble family might betroth their 5-year-old daughter to a 10-year-old son of a neighboring lord, solidifying an alliance or ensuring the transfer of land and titles across generations. This practice ensured that family lines and wealth remained intact, and political alliances were secured for decades. For the young girl, this meant her destiny was sealed from the moment of her birth. She was raised not as an individual with her own dreams, but as a future wife and mother, destined for a specific household, often far from her own family. Her education, if she received any, would be geared towards domestic skills and religious instruction, preparing her for her inevitable role. Concept of a girl having agency in her own marriage, let alone her childhood, was entirely alien. She was a pawn in a larger dynastic game. When she reached the age of sexual maturity, sometimes as young as 12, the marriage would be consummated, forcing her into an adult role long before she was psychologically or emotionally prepared. The physical dangers of early childbearing, often leading to complications or death for both mother and child, were substantial. Her entire identity became subsumed by her marital status. Her childhood abruptly ended by the demands of her husband's household and the expectation of producing heirs. Across the vast lands of the Islamic Caliphates, while there was often legal precedent for marriage only upon maturity, The cultural practice of marrying off young girls was also widespread, especially in rural areas and among certain social strata. Girls could be betrothed, and sometimes even married, at very young ages, often shortly after puberty began or even before, though consummation might be delayed. The rationale was often to secure a suitable match before other opportunities arose, to prevent premarital relationships, or to ensure that girls were married into honorable families. A father or male guardian held the right to arrange marriages for his daughters, and while some schools of thought required a minor girl's consent upon reaching puberty, this was often a theoretical right difficult to exercise in practice against overwhelming family pressure. A young girl might find herself married to a much older man, perhaps a widower, or someone with multiple wives, immediately thrust into a complex adult world she was ill-equipped to navigate. Her life as a child, her time for play and learning was abruptly cut short, replaced by the responsibilities of a wife and future mother. The psychological impact of being forced into such a union, robbed of a childhood and personal choice, was profound. She became the property of her husband's family, expected to be subservient, to bear children, and to integrate into an unfamiliar household, often without any emotional connection to her spouse. The expectation of obedience and the lack of recourse for an unhappy marriage meant that child brides often faced a lifetime of vulnerability and hardship, their voices unheard and their well-being entirely dependent on the disposition of their husbands and in-laws. In many parts of medieval India, child marriage was deeply embedded in social and religious customs, and its practice was widespread across various castes and communities. Girls were often married before puberty, sometimes as early as 6 or 7 years old, though the actual departure to the husband's home might be deferred for a few years. The reasons were manifold: to ensure the girl's virginity and family honor, to secure alliances between families, to protect daughters in a patriarchal society, or to fulfill religious obligations. For a young girl, this meant her entire childhood was an unspoken preparation for marriage. She had no say in the matter, and her parents arranged her future based on their own social and economic considerations. The marriage ceremony would often involve a child bride, perhaps clad in adult finery, participating in rituals she did not understand, being handed over to a man she did not know. Upon reaching puberty, she would be sent to her husband's home, a foreign environment, where she was expected to immediately assume the duties of a wife, often under the strict supervision of her mother-in-law. Her education would be minimal, if any, focused solely on domestic chores and religious practices. The physical risks of early childbirth were immense, leading to high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Psychologically, these girls were often traumatized, their lives dictated by the whims of their husbands and his family, with no power to assert their own desires or even to understand their circumstances. They were children forced into adult roles, stripped of their agency, their innocence, and their fundamental right to a childhood. Their lives irrevocably shaped by a decision made for them years before they could even grasp its meaning. Their very existence was a testament to the fact that their worth was seen solely in their capacity to perpetuate a lineage and serve a husband, not as developing individuals. Number 7. Limited property, rights, and economic dependence. Imagine a world where everything you own, everything you inherit, and everything you work for is not truly yours but legally belongs to your husband or male relatives. Picture your life intricately tied to the whims of men, your economic security a fragile thread that could snap at any moment due to male caprice, death, or misfortune. Around 900-odd, for the vast majority of women, marriage often meant a profound loss of property rights and a deep, systemic economic dependence on men, trapping them in a cycle of vulnerability and often forcing them into lives of quiet desperation. In much of Christian Europe, particularly under Germanic and Roman-influenced legal traditions, a woman's legal identity was largely subsumed by that of her husband upon marriage. This concept, often summarized as Coverture, in later English common law, meant that a married woman had little to no independent legal standing. She could not own property in her own name, enter into contracts, sue or be sued, or manage her own inheritance without her husband's consent. Any property she brought into the marriage, such as her dowry, or any property she inherited during the marriage, legally became her husband's to manage, control, and often to dispose of. While some systems might have theoretical protections for a woman's dower, or portions of her dowry in the event of widowhood, gaining access to these assets was often a complex and challenging legal battle against male relatives, who might view her as an outsider. For the duration of her marriage, a woman had virtually no economic autonomy. Her husband controlled all financial decisions, including what was spent on her, her children, and the household. This meant that even if a woman came from a wealthy family, she could find herself in poverty if her husband was a poor manager, a gambler, or simply neglectful. She was completely dependent on his goodwill and his economic fortunes. This lack of independent property rights meant that women could not secure their own future, could not make investments, could not truly plan for contingencies, and were utterly at the mercy of their husband's financial decisions. If her husband died, she might be left with nothing if she had no dower, or if it was difficult to claim, forcing her to rely on the charity of her family or the church, a stark contrast to the life she might have led if she had retained control over her own assets. Her entire material existence was tethered to her husband's will, ensuring her perpetual subordination. Across the Byzantine Empire, while some elements of Roman law allowed for women to own property under specific circumstances, the reality for most married women, around 900, had still leaned heavily towards male control. The husband typically managed all marital property, including the dowry the wife brought, and her ability to control her own assets was significantly restricted. While a woman might retain nominal ownership of certain properties, her husband held the usufruct, the right to use and profit from the property, and her ability to sell, mortgage, or dispose of it was often limited without his consent. This meant that even if a woman was wealthy, her financial agency was severely curtailed. She could not engage in independent economic activities, run a business, or make significant financial decisions without her husband's approval, or that of a male guardian if she was unmarried. This created a deep reliance on her husband for all material needs, from food and clothing to housing and support for her children. If her husband was abusive, irresponsible, or simply chose to withhold resources, she had little recourse. Her economic vulnerability made it virtually impossible to leave an unhappy or dangerous marriage, as she would have no independent means of survival. The system effectively stripped women of their financial independence, ensuring that their economic security was always contingent on the good graces of the men in their lives, trapping them in a gilded cage, if wealthy, or in abject poverty. Her economic personhood was absorbed into that of her husband, rendering her a dependent rather than an autonomous individual. In many parts of Islamic society, while Islamic law provided women with the theoretical right to own property independently, inherit, and manage their own wealth, the practical application and societal norms in 900 had often presented significant challenges and limitations. A woman received a dower from her husband at the time of marriage, which was legally hers to keep and manage. She could also inherit from her parents and other relatives, typically half the share of a male heir, and could own and manage her own businesses or property. However, despite these legal provisions, social customs, and the prevailing patriarchal structures often limited a woman's effective control over her assets. Many women, especially those in less educated or poorer segments of society, might not have been fully aware of their rights, or might have been pressured by male relatives to hand over management of their property, or even to relinquish it entirely. Her male relatives or husband might exert influence, or simply take de facto control of her assets, citing her lack of business, acumen, or protection from male interference. Furthermore, a woman's economic opportunities were often severely restricted by societal norms that limited her movement and public presence. While she might own property, her ability to actively engage in commerce or manage large estates was constrained by expectations of seclusion or domesticity. Thus, even with legal rights on paper, the social reality for many women was one of continued economic dependence. Her property might be legally hers, but her husband's control over her life, her movements, and her access to the public sphere often meant that her economic independence was more theoretical than practical, leaving her vulnerable and reliant on male goodwill for her daily sustenance and long-term security. Her individual economic power was often neutralized by the broader societal framework that dictated her place within the home. Number 8. Ritual defilement and social ostracism for deviation. Imagine living in a society where your very worth and purity were tied to rigid social codes, and any deviation, any perceived misstep, particularly in the realm of marriage and sexuality, could lead to your complete social destruction, ostracism, and even violence. Around 900 odd, for women across diverse cultures, the threat of ritual defilement or social condemnation for failing to adhere to specific norms of virginity, fidelity, or marital purity was a deeply oppressive force, stripping them of their honor, their community. These were not just social stigmas. They were often absolute condemnations that left no room for redemption or a new life. In many parts of Christian Europe, the concept of female purity and virginity before marriage was paramount, upheld by both religious doctrine and social custom. A bride was expected to be a virgin, and her honor, as well as her family's, rested upon this expectation. Any hint of premarital sexual activity for a woman could lead to the cancellation of betrothals, social disgrace for her and her family, and the likelihood of her being considered unmarriageable or a fallen woman. Such women might be forced into convents as a form of penance, or become outcasts with no means of support. Within marriage, fidelity was also strictly enforced for women. Adultery on the part of the wife was considered a grave offense, often leading to divorce initiated by the husband, and in some regions, even to severe legal punishments, including physical violence or public shaming. While a husband's infidelity might be overlooked or tolerated, a wife's was seen as a betrayal of the marital bond, a tainting of the lineage, and an unforgivable sin. Purity of the bloodline, especially for aristocratic families, depended on the wife's absolute fidelity. A woman accused of adultery would lose her dower, her social standing, and often her children, becoming a pariah with no place in respectable society. This created a dual standard where women's sexual behavior was rigorously controlled and policed, while men enjoyed far greater latitude. Constant threat of social ostracism for perceived or actual defilement created an immense pressure on women to conform to suppress their own desires, and to live in perpetual fear of judgment, ensuring their absolute adherence to patriarchal sexual norms and their perpetual subservience within the rigid social order. Across the vast lands of medieval India, particularly within evolving Hindu social structures, the honor of a family was intrinsically linked to the purity and conduct of its women. Virginity before marriage was an absolute requirement, and any suspicion of a girl having engaged in premarital sexual activity could bring irreparable shame upon her family, making her unmarriageable and socially outcast. Once married, a woman's fidelity to her husband was paramount, often extending even beyond his death, as seen in the expectation of no widow remarriage. Adultery on the part of the wife was considered a severe transgression, a spiritual and social defilement that could lead to her expulsion from the marital home, social boycott, and even physical violence from her husband or in-laws. She would lose all rights and be condemned as an impure woman, with no social standing or means of support. Concept of Patagrata, the ideal of a devoted and chaste wife, held immense cultural power, and deviation from this ideal was met with severe social condemnation. Women were expected to uphold the honor of their lineage, and any perceived sexual transgression was seen as a dishonor to the entire family, not just to herself. This meant women lived under constant scrutiny, their every action and interaction potentially subject to judgment. The fear of being branded as impure, of bringing shame upon her family, was a powerful tool of control, forcing women into absolute compliance with societal expectations of chastity and obedience. Their very social existence was contingent upon their adherence to these rigid norms, making any deviation a form of social suicide, leaving them utterly vulnerable and without a safety net in a society that offered no forgiveness. In some parts of the Islamic world, while Islamic law provided certain protections and due process for accusations of adultery, the societal pressures and interpretations of purity could still lead to extreme social ostracism for women accused of sexual transgressions. While proof of adultery required 4 eyewitnesses for legal conviction, a mere accusation or strong suspicion could ruin a woman's reputation and her standing in the community. Women were expected to uphold modesty and chastity, and any perceived deviation from these norms could lead to severe social consequences, including a loss of marriage prospects, family dishonor, and isolation. If a woman was believed to have brought shame upon her family, even without legal conviction, she might be disowned, confined to the home, or left with no social support. Her perceived defilement could lead to her being considered an outcast, stripping her of social connections and economic opportunities. While a man might face some social censure for certain sexual behaviors, the consequences for a woman were almost always far more severe and often irreversible. The burden of proof for female purity and adherence to sexual norms was often placed squarely on the woman herself, and failure to meet these stringent expectations, whether real or imagined, resulted in a form of social death, leaving her vulnerable and without honor or community in a world that offered little mercy for those who deviated from its rigid expectations of female conduct. Her honor was not her own, but a reflection of her family's and husband's, and any blemish on it could spell her utter ruin.